Hello, everyone. Boy, it has been a while since I've been back. I've not been allowed to stay at Holiday Inn Express lately. Finally, I was able to get back and I had an epiphany, a true epiphany for once in my life. So here we are ready to go with Dork Cast episode number 7. We're going to call it Immersed in Analytics. And like I always have, I can't trust my own crazy ideas. So what we're going to do is go ahead, and I've got some friends along for the ride. My first guest today is David Chomo. David is the data visualization principal in Humana, and David is on LinkedIn there. If you want to take a screenshot, you can reach out to all my guests. David I've known for quite a while. He helped film my Dorkcast number 6 on data storytelling and data literacy. I friended David while I supported Humana for many years. I get not only good food in Louisville, but great company, and got to see the way his approach to data storytelling enabled adoption of applications. And I'm not talking about, ooh, geez, can we get 100 people to finally sign in? We're talking thousands and thousands of end users consuming data that they understood and took action on. So David, it's been a long time sitting in the green room waiting for me to film episode 7, buddy, but I appreciate your being back. My next guest is Robert Spivak, and if you've seen my posts on LinkedIn recently, you'll see a lot of interaction with Robert. Robert is not only a business intelligence and machine learning entrepreneur, he's a fellow blogger at Data on the Rocks, and has written quite a few posts. When I say that he's looking at machine learning, he's not like me, who's stayed at a Holiday Inn Express and then looked at a Python video. He's actually trying to simulate machine learning in Qlik script code so that he can understand at the scientific mathematical level how machine learning actually works. And then just for fun recently, he started posting some 3D extensions in Qlik. So he's taking data that's three-dimensional from object files, just pure OBJ files he pulls from his phone, converts it into a 2D world, and then simulates with Qlik Sense and a map objects, those things. I was like, oh my gosh, gotta have Robert on for this particular session that you'll understand why in a second. My final guest is a longtime friend, Zach Ivey. Zach not only is the lead BI developer at Titus Human Performance and working on Qlik and analytics and working with all kinds of different data sets. Zach is also remarkable in graphic design and branding, and I know firsthand because he's the guy who came up with the Qlik Dork logo and helped me brand what I did so many years ago. The funniest thing I want to tell you about Zach, though, as it relates to my personal growth, we worked together and we would go out to lunch and he'd start a story with something exciting. Did you know what happened to David? Oh, no, I don't. 20 minutes later, my sandwich would be gone, my chips are gone, and he's going through the background detail. First, it just annoyed me, like, give me the facts, give me the facts, give me the facts, let's move on. Eventually, I really began appreciating storytelling and how much more meaningful when I found out what happened to David, it was knowing the background. So he took like a dragnet, Joe Friday, just give me the facts, and helped me become the data storytelling, either machine I am or a crazy person that I am. So Zach, thank you for taking some time out of your schedule to be here as well, buddy.
Thank you.
All right. So what we're going to be talking about today, my epiphany came when I was looking through a product from Immersion Analytics. Immersion Analytics is a partner of Qlik, and what they do is they take data right out of the Qlik application, and it's interactive, so I can make selections in the tool or in Qlik, and they can visualize that data over 20 different ways. Well, as I was going through there, an epiphany came that I'll share momentarily. which is the reason that we're having this. So I've got their website on there if you're interested. The goal of this presentation and what we're filming today isn't so much you seeing 18 things going at once, although at the end, I'll let you know, I'm going to show you a few at once so that maybe it ties together what we're saying. What we're going to be looking at is really more the nature of how we visualize data. So in the two-dimensional world, I could visualize an axis like this, and I've got dots, and we usually think of them as a dimension and a measure. And we think of what we're marking on either, and that's the limit to what we think of. And then we think, oh, it'd be better for me to do a bar chart to show a measure or a scatter plot to show two measures. And that's the limit to what we can accomplish in our storytelling for our data. And when you work in an organization and you've got a whole lot of measures, you are apt to build 50 scatter plots or 50 bar charts. And then you say, Robert, I can't believe you can't assimilate 50 bar charts, 3 pie charts, and put all of those things in your head contextually. And that's what the tool does. But my epiphany was as I looked at this and I looked at size, and that's what we think of dots as having size. In a three-dimensional world, I realized I'm not looking at size, I'm looking at volume. And what I was showing for my measure using volume as a visual principle was the fact I was showing a count, but showing it as a volume. So guys, as you think about looking at a sphere as opposed to a dot, what other things do you think come to mind maybe for humans? How could we relate that sphere to a human that might sink in faster or longer term, or help them understand data as part of data literacy even better? Any thoughts?
Whenever I first saw this, I thought of a apple tree, because if you're a machine, like a leaf and an apple are objects with different shapes. But if you're a person, they have 2 different colors. They hold 2 way different values depending on whether or not you're hungry. But we are evolved to identify an apple out of thousands and thousands of leaves because of the color, because of the shape. But if you look at hundreds of cells in a spreadsheet that are full, normal people can't look at that and see a pattern or see any kind of nuance. So when I saw this kind of data displayed this way, it was the first time I thought, oh wow, we could be crossing a threshold here in technology where you are finding what you're looking for as naturally as you've ever had the opportunity to find it. Like you could go and locate it by shape, by color, by the things that we're used to identifying things in our world. It's not hard to find a rubber duck in a bathtub. It's just, it pops. Like, you know what the difference between those materials are just from their properties. So it's really interesting to think to assign properties to data, and then you have it because it's a cluster of grapes, because it's an apple, because it's a yellow rubber duck in water. It's obvious. It's really
fantastic. Great tips that we'll come back to as we get to some of these others, because you kind of hit the nail on the head. There's things about other properties together,
right, that
would make it a cluster of grapes versus a bunch of individual grapes.
Right.
Right. Any thoughts, David or Robert, on just hearing the word volume versus size? How do you think that would correlate? What kind of business terms or The way analysts think of data might think of it as volume versus size. What do you think that might mean to them?
I think there's always the risk of using it in the wrong way. So you take something that doesn't really have a size in the real world, and you put it as a size in the ball or in the blobs here. So the trick will always, when we go to these kind of presentations, multidimensional analytics, we need to really be careful on choosing the right dimensions for the right measure. So I think it will be clear for each data set what is actually the size and what is the color. And it's very different. I mean, if you go to a normal retail analytics, of course, you can look at sales volume as a size of this. But perhaps margin is not as clear. But there's always, for every data set, you will have to take a decision on what should be in what kind of dimension in this kind of analytics. And I think also it's very important to be able to rotate things when it comes to size, particularly.
Right.
Because it's really difficult to see what is bigger and what is smaller if you can't rotate things.
Correct.
So for that reason, I think size and volume is it's the most risky ones. I think what we're going to see.
Yeah, and honestly too, if you break down how cognitively our brain processes visual information, we want relationships. So to that point, being able to rotate allows you to understand contextually that relationship to other things.
Right.
The volume itself tells a story, but if your story is multidimensional and you want to tell more than one story around the data visualization or the volume itself, because volume by itself is a statistical fact, but why does the volume matter? To your point earlier, size versus volume, regardless, it's more of a clarification of the story that size doesn't always equal volume and vice versa. But if my story is volume and I know that it is a volume story, now I have to find the ways to not only tell that volume story in the most clear visual way possible. Three-dimensionality always helps with volume versus size.
Yep.
But then being able to define what about that volume story is important. That's currently, at least in this example, is in part what's missing. You're giving a lot of information that an individual cognitively has to piece together to understand what am I actually looking at and why is it important. You have folks like Tufte and Alberto Cairo and others that talk about things around visual noise or chart junk. We have to make sure that if we complicate the visual with 3D, or even in some cases 4D, which I've seen, we have to be able to simplify the story down that three-dimensionality makes sense, that it is a critical point of the story and not just somebody trying to fancy up the chart.
Absolutely. All great ideas. And that was really kind of the epiphany for me. I was using a size to really represent a magnitude, but I was doing it with a multitude. And so then I realized, I need to switch what dimensionality measure I was using, that I was using volume for, to fit so it made sense. A couple of things I happen to think, one of the things I want to make sure we do is talk use cases and how maybe the fact that this is a sphere would fit for a use case extremely well, right? This isn't going to fit for a financial dashboard, perhaps. But if I was doing, what so many do, social media analysis, how cool is it that I have a sphere that could represent my volume or sphere of influence, right? Because now logically I have a sphere as opposed to a bar on a chart. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. And obviously we look at this and there's a lot of color there. So I don't want to talk about the fact there happens to be a lot of color there where it's isolated, right? what are the business use cases perhaps where I want red to stand out for the apple versus purple for the grapes? Can you think of good use cases for color where maybe combined with the volume, the color would make sense for the object, versus in this case where it's only one dimension, it's just randomly colored across the board?
So I think one of the things that you have to be mindful of and careful of going down this road of multiple, singular objects telling multiple stories. So sphere tells one story, color tells a second story, but then you're adding multiple colors. There's a cognitive load that we have to be careful of, excuse me, that an individual can only process so much information in a certain amount of time. So when you start applying color has to be a supportive element to the story, not a secondary story. So for example, in your sphere, purple, or sphere means volume, purple sphere means volumes of grapes, hypothetically speaking. That's two stories, but they are supporting each other because you're talking about grapes and the volume of grapes. But when you start to add a dimension to say size of sphere is volume, grapes are equal to purple, but purple is also representative of another story element, then you start to get a little overwhelmed. So the bottom line to that is simplification. You have to understand what your story is and what you're trying to say with it, and you find the right visual elements to support the story, whether it be the size or shape and color. If you start to add another dimension to the story about grape volume, whether it be, let's say, variance up or down, then you have to start to be careful of, am I going down a road of overcomplicating what was a simple story, great volume? Now it's great volume, trend over time. You start to deal with that three-dimensionality and you're going to start to get an overly complicated visual. So you just have to kind of pick and choose, what am I really trying to say? Is it a trend story? Is it a volume story? Is it, a scale story? What is a comparison to apples? I think once you figure that out, a lot of those decision-making elements starts to become easier and the problems solve themselves.
Right. So Robert, I know you've been lately starting to do a lot of work three-dimensionally with Qlik Sense in what is a two-dimensional flat screen. What interested me about color, because even if you look at these, you can start now seeing shading, or we could potentially add other properties that might be different than just coloring things blue or purple or red. Have you started to consider, as you're visualizing things, the fact that color might take other properties to reflect the shading or where it is in the map or the
for me at the moment, I think of color as actually three dimensions, because it's the color that we say the hue, if it's red or blue or yellow, and then we have the luminosity and the saturation, and those can be used. Those three can be used separately. So basically, we can have grapes as purple, but then you can change the luminosity and the saturation to make it less relevant, less secure value, etc., or further away, if you like, in the 3D world, further away in time, more accurate value, or etc. So you can, for me, color is three dimensions actually, and I would agree that it has to, the color, the hue that you choose has to be relevant. Definitely, to be able to associate it to the right thing. So if you have purple, that it's going to be grapes, and green is apples, and yellow is oranges, and then you keep that. But then you can alter the other values depending on other factors.
Yep.
And that makes it really interesting, because actually now in your presentation you already have size and color. For me, that's four dimensions.
And we're kind of at the limit of what most normal two-dimensional charts would do. So Zach, you brought up, apples versus grapes. One of the things I want to talk about is shape. Now, this particular tool offers a plethora of shapes. What I've done here was I tried to visualize shape as a measure that would represent a variance year over year. So the half circles are years where I did better last year than I did this year. The hollow circles, or the little donut things there, now I'm getting hungry and it's lunchtime, would represent years that may be within 5% of variance, where I've got the full sphere to represent, hey, this year was clearly better than last year. Do you think that type of a shape would help people convey that information, where I'm looking at maybe the volume for this year in context with last year as well?
You know, Robert spoke to this a second ago, but it's as we choose what, you know, shape, a certain shape for a graphical representation, it's difficult moving from, as a person, moving from chart to chart if they have different properties, having different qualities. For example, you know, in this case, a donut, I'll pick on a donut because I too am getting hungry. That might be good, or it might be the full sphere, and you have to define what that is super clearly to know whether or not that represents value for you. I keep thinking about walking through this three-dimensional, you know, graph and being able to look around and pick what I think is most valuable based on color and shape. So you'd have to be really consistent, you know, if you were to show whatever this graph were to show across the entire organization. I think of David's reach and how many users, you know, David provides advice for services for so many. You just have to be hyper consistent to define, you know, a sphere is good, or the donut is good, or whatever is the good thing, and make sure that you understand the relationship. I think
so. I shouldn't just prick pity shapes like a heart and a puppy or something. No, I mean, Dave's like, no, don't do that.
Puppies are compelling, but I don't know if that would work. David, you're muted if you're talking.
Sorry about that. No, but the problem is that it's not even a problem. It's a challenge that is what people do, because right. they don't think through the choice enough. And here's the thing. We don't have the ability to process more than a certain amount of dimensions, to Robert's point. When you start getting into the 4, 5, 6 range, now we're dealing with size, volume, spatial relationships, shape, color, value, total ranges of color. That's a lot of information to start to tell a singular story. So I think it's more about decision making to say, do I need to have different shapes? And if so, what are those shapes that do more accurately represent what I'm trying to say? But when I do pick shapes, we need to pick a few shapes, not many shapes. And then, exactly. Yeah, so it's kind of a hierarchical decision making, or a decision process to go through to understand, what do I really need to support the story? It's not that you can't have multiple shapes at multiple sizes, in multiple scale relationships, in multiple colors and tone ranges. You can. I haven't seen a lot of successful solutions when you have that many dimensions to it, visual dimensions to it.
Gotcha.
But I think it can be done. The one challenge that I have with this particular visual is that everything is colorized or colored the same color, which tells me that I'm now drawing the audience to focus on a story of measurement of a singular thing different ways. So when you start separating that out, though, and you make some, what I think is logical assumptions, that an individual is going to say a circle means this, a half circle means this, a sphere means this, that's fine. But by simply tying them together with a singular color,
Right.
you start to create that juxtaposition in the brain to say, well, wait a minute, what am I tracking here?
Right.
And so, you want to be careful of those kinds of decisions as well. But at the end of the day, multiple shapes is a perfectly good solution to telling multiple stories.
Yeah, and you guys are bringing up the great point. What I'm trying to do, I'm focusing on one visual attribute now, and then we'll work up to more.
I have a reflection.
Go ahead, Robert.
And that is that for me also shape is a dual here. Shape in terms of different kind of shapes. If we go back to the previous, we had the different fruits. The shape could actually be a body dimension for the color to help people to understand that purple is grapes, and then you keep the shape of a grape for purple and always consistent.
Sure.
So and that kind of makes sense to help the color dimension a little bit, and they're always aligned. So basically, they are one dimension but visualized in two different ways.
Yep.
And I think that can help. But as everyone is saying, we need to keep it simple.
Yes.
But shape can also be like you have done here, the half-eaten donut. That tells us a different story. We can still see that, or we could assume that it's a donut, but it's half-eaten, so it says something more. And that's for me the new dimension.
Yep. And what I was trying to visualize, the size of the donut was my sales this year. And I know that it's a half donut, which means my sales this year were worse than last year.
Yeah.
Right. Or my sales are gigantic, but they're equivalent to what they were last year, versus a middle-sized sphere. The sales aren't as big as the other one, but they're getting bigger because they're higher than they were last year. So I tried to use just shape and size, no colors yet, to kind of let you see a combination story there. Let's take a look next, because one of the things, because of color and shading and luminosity, all of the things that Robert, the coder behind the scenes, would know what to do. As you look at this property is called bumpiness. Right. When I used this, and I realized as I was visualizing my friend's Peloton data, one of his measures was resistance. And then I happened to think, holy cow, if I use this property, the surface appears rough to simulate a rougher ride than one of those that's doesn't appear rough. Does that make sense?
It does. I want to instinctually send out a warning though about texture, because texture can be misconstrued and it's not as clear of a visualization. And I think the reason being is, historically speaking, we are used to seeing size, shape, color. Texture is relatively new in the sense that you don't want to mislead somebody. You can represent bumpiness, or in this case, the roughness of a ride, by size as well. The bigger the sphere, the more rough it is, or the smaller the sphere, the less rough it is. So, or you could represent that through heat mapping via color. There's a number of different ways to show roughness of ride besides texture. The challenge that I have with texture is that when we do use it, it's usually fill in a bar with horizontal lines or vertical lines or hash marking. And texture becomes just a noise to a lot of people when you can represent it different ways. So I think if you use texture, it has to represent texture. To your point, bumpiness or roughness of a ride, I think it makes sense as a supportive story element, but I don't know if it's going to be as intuitive to a lot of people seeing it for the first time.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm going to get to you, Zach. The size here was the volume of work done for a ride, and the bumpiness reflects how difficult the ride was. right? So I am combining to give a more complete story, right? So Zach, as you look at it, what other words might come to mind to you regarding, bumpiness, unevenness? What other words come to mind for you as you think about the type of health data you deal with when you see that? Does the word rough or bumpy mean something different than what we can do slashes in a two-dimensional bar chart?
I mean, there are several things that sort of come to mind in terms of like what you've described in terms of difficulty, or there's even like some altitude variance that comes to mind. I'm sure on the Peloton data specifically would have been an incline or decline slope, but I agree with David in the digital space. This bumpiness texture is super difficult to get across as a property. Someone could look at this and think that was just a failing of the graphical mapping, but it's not. It was intentional. So it could be useful, but I think there are a lot of other options to represent it.
That's and what I'm hoping is I think we're all agreeing this is really different.
Sure.
3D world is way different than what the world's used to. And what I'm hoping to get is, are there positive things that we could, as we begin, again, right now it's one, well, in this case two, right? Volume of work, roughness of ride. What I'm hoping we can do is identify those business cases where it would absolutely make sense, right? Like if I was running, I know one of your metrics is sprints. If I were tracking the altitude at which those sprints were done,
right,
would combining those things in this way, would that be a good use case for bumpiness, which I may not be able to get across in a 2D world?
I mean, absolutely. In that, you rarely, whenever you see a table of test results, we'll stick with sprints. You rarely would be able to say, hey, this happened at that altitude. And so understandably, their sprint is slower just from the way they manage oxygen. So there are, altitude would be an influencer and therefore would be interesting to display in combination with sprint times or really any other performance-based time. So there's definitely, that definitely could play out.
And keep thinking of smart words like that are acronyms or metaphors we could use for that visual property. So I'm almost hesitant to get to the one that literally is called texture.
I have some thoughts there on the previous one.
Okay, sure.
So I think in this case, in this particular scenario, I think the roughness should be visualized with color rather, because like if it's really rough, it should maybe go towards red. That makes most sense to most people. I think that red is more difficult and green is nice, like it's traffic light basics. But roughness, I mean the texture actually, I can definitely see a use for that, and that would be to visualize uncertainty. Like lack of data quality or something.
I like it.
Because it could, it gives that kind of signal. Like this surface is not really clean, so there must be something missing in the data.
I know this might be another property, but I agree with you, like maybe even transparency.
Transparency, diffuseness, or cloudness, or this kind of, that they all belong to the same category.
Nice. Now we're cooking. Because we're going to get visual properties that are exactly those words. So let's go ahead and jump forth, just for the sake of time, to texture, just a little bit different. And one of the things, the color is actually the same on these objects. The texture of it is almost like, I would think of it like a shield, or something that's coming together over the surface, which ends up changing based on how tightly wound that security is, or whatever the property that you think might represent texture in this way, ends up making the object also appear a different color. The more you zoom in, like on this one here, you can see it's like little squares interconnected where there's some pieces missing or more pieces put together.
My gut reaction
come to mind as unique words that might in a good use case be represented this way.
Oh, I was going to go opposite. I feel like this is almost thinking too deeply about something. It's almost kind of like overusing something or using it in the wrong way. You can accomplish all of the ways that you described the goal of the visualization a half a dozen other ways. So if you were to then try to use texture in the right way, ultimately to your question, I would actually have a hard time finding a use case for that, to be honest. But I'm sure there's something out there in the world that I don't belong in that it is useful, but for the world that I live in, you know, measuring data for insight, for leadership, decision-making within an enterprise, that is such a level of complexity that it would almost do more harm than good.
Gotcha. And again, we're looking at this isolated,
right?
Really thinking again, the big picture is I've got a whole bunch of things I need to get in their mind. If I looked at this and something else and something else and something else, does that help a lot of information get to mind? And my final use case, I'm going to show you an example that I think does. It helps transfer a lot of information. And any thoughts, Robert, on the difference between bumpiness and texture?
Yeah, texture for me it could work as a diversity on sales. So basically, how big of your assortment is the customer buying? If every dot is a customer, every sphere is a customer. How do they on what you're selling? What is the diversity? Like they only buy a product group A and B, but not the other 20 product groups. That could be visualized maybe in some kind of pattern on the sphere.
Fantastic. And that's what I was hoping for, some word like that logically that does make sense. And again, it's going to have to be the right use case. I'm absolutely not saying, hey, let's just throw this out there because we have it. Any other ideas, Zach? Like Robert's mentioned diversity. What else might come to mind?
I'm pretty literal on this one. I keep thinking about like an atmosphere constraining the sort of planet, but that, you know, depending on what the minimum version of this property is and the maximum version would make me inform me as to whether or not that was actually useful. But also, though, I've been influenced by the Mars Perseverance story recently, so I'm thinking about those properties, and I mean, it looks like planets to me, and the textures of that, and across one dimension, I can see this telling a certain kind of story just because it influences color and hue. But across multiple dimensions, I'll be interested to see how you've used that.
And that's another great point, right? Here I'm looking at, you know, maybe 10 levels. These things can be constrained, which I think might even add more value. Maybe I'm going to confine, here's how many buckets of properties I have, right? I don't want to look at 1,000 different diversities. Maybe I want to look at 3 diversities to where those textures really stand out. Fantastic. Now, one of the things you just said was atmosphere, and dude, like always in my life, you've always been a step ahead of me in story. As you see this one, now this is where 3-dimensionally we can show other properties like atmosphere, right? So as I look at that, I could think, is the whiteness stormy, indicating something bad? Is it cloudy, or could it be, simulating good things like the lifeblood of the company flowing? So what I thought was really interesting is we start moving to a three-dimensional property in a three-dimensional space. Does this make sense? Would this be the kind of thing, if you were looking at atmosphere for a company, is that the kind of property that might make sense three-dimensionally?
I actually think that if this was a rolling 12 sales, the shimmerness could be the rolling 3 sales.
Okay.
So if a customer has a large last 3 months sales, then it shimmers more. But then you have the size of the sphere is the 12 months sales. So it could make sense, because in a bigger screen, you could easily spot the ones that are doing really bad or really good now, because they shimmer.
Right. And I've combined stories that should be, if the person has received some training, should be pretty obvious. I could focus on the story I'm most interested in. But if I saw something that was small or large, I also have that other property that would tell me something more full for the complete story, right?
Well, and I think to Robert's point, volatility, it's really, I think it would be a great way to show the instability and kind of focus on that word. And that could be very easily measured in a number of ways for both individual and enterprise use cases. The more it shimmers, the more volatile it is. Mm-hmm. And maybe that shimmer volatility happens to align with the larger sphere. So now you're getting that, again, supportive story that the shimmer volatility supports the size, or vice versa. Because honestly, when I look at this, I almost don't look at the size of the spheres first. My eye and my brain is being distracted by the thing that's moving,
right?
Or the just the animation, if you will.
Right.
So again, what do you want to come across first? Volatility or the size of the sphere? And if the answer to that is that they conflict, then you have to make a logical decision of which one comes first.
Gotcha.
And that's where you can really start to refine, still use the technique, but refine the story.
You could also look at diameter, like I agree with you, David. The ones that are moving are the ones that catch my eye, but the diameter of the spheres might indicate the market share. So that obviously you would address the ones that are moving, but the larger ones that are moving are the ones to address first. That's the way to rank them in terms of their influence on a company.
Right.
Yep. Perfect. And that's what I'm loving. This is exactly where I hope the conversation was going to go. As these types of things come out, right, we're really sitting here as the four of us trying to address the market that others won't see for a year, 2 years down the road. And then it becomes, I've got all of these new visual properties I've never had access to before. Mm-hmm. Stephen Few hasn't written a book on this. Steve Wexler, hi Steve, shout out to my buddy, hasn't written a book on these things yet. We're looking at things and we have got to help the industry figure out, how would I use what's available, right? So now I'm going to jump to another one. This is an axis. So it's got lines in my planet, right, that has an axis. What, as you look at these and you see the size of the line, what things come to mind?
Standard deviation.
Dude, you are the man.
No, but it does remind me of I mean, I know there aren't like smaller lines on that, but it just reminds me of what that would look like. The longer the line, the more deviant that data, like that would really need to be looked at. So if you saw lines and they were still large when you zoomed in, you knew this was a big deal.
And so that indicator might help engage somebody into drilling into that data, wouldn't it?
More so than shimmer or whatever, so if you're stacking properties, it could be the right color and it can be shimmering, which might catch my attention, but I would ignore all that if I saw one with very long protruding lines that had to do with standard deviation or some property that I cared about.
Very good, because there's if you read any of my blogs, there's always variance. What I need to know is it's statistical variance or just there. So Robert, you owe me one that he beat you as a mathematician to standard deviation, buddy. I'll let you get this next one then. You can chime in first.
I had it written on my palm, Robert.
Oh man, you cheater. So one of the things, there's actually 3 separate properties: an X angle, a Y angle, and a Z angle, where you can see that line now, it has been tilted. What comes to your mind, Robert, as a way I could use that angle to potentially indicate something? Or if we go back to, I'm gonna say it for everybody out there in the pie chart world, is it really hard for me to see the angle of the line? And is that where I would want some defined buckets? I'm aligned, I'm slightly off of variance, I'm way off of variance. And not worry, is it 5 degrees or 20 degrees? I want to clearly see I'm off my axis somehow. What things come to mind, Robert?
I think it comes back to the discussion we had about shapes, that we need to keep, if we tilted the lines, we need to keep it very simple and have like 45, 90, 0 degrees system. And then it basically shows the trend or the direction of this measure. So where is it going next? So in this case, it's going slightly up. So I can assume that it has a positive trend.
Now, but with that said,
combine those two and make the line length how much, and the line direction, the trend, either positive, negative, or staying the same.
Right. Yeah, the forewarning on this type of story, though, is if you start to add the 3-dimensionality, not of the sphere, but the space, now you've got to make sure that the arrows are pointing in consistently up or down direction in kind of almost more of a flat angle, because it can go in every which angle. So then it confuses that story. Now, with that said, I absolutely agree with Robert, and I was going to say that it, for that predictive modeling scenario, or that predictability of not just where are we now and where are we going and are we on the right trend or path, but where could that lead us to if it continues? And I think that anytime you draw a literal arrow, which we are trained to know that means direction, you have to make sure that you mean direction. And you've got to make sure that you mean in that particular direction. And then you've got to have the story of direction up is good, direction down is bad, or what does that directional element mean?
Right.
If you train somebody to understand what the visual element is, then this tells the right or good story. It's concerning that, to Robert's point, that the arrows, again, just in this example, are so minutely angled, or there seems to be no rhyme or reason to the degrees of which those angles are set at. Therefore, that's a little confusing. But the idea that the arrow's pointing up at varying degrees does tell a story. So
right, exactly. And I love seeing the excitement in you guys as you're realizing multiples of these could be put together. And I'm telling a really thorough story for people. Next one is something I loved. It's a glow, right? I'm simply illuminating something. When you're looking at this, what's the first thing that comes to mind, Zach, when you see that glow? What's your first thought?
My first thought is that the glow looks like it's coming from behind the object and not from within the object.
Okay.
But I find this one to be difficult difficult to perceive. Even a light or whatever is light and strong are difficult to differentiate, in my opinion.
Okay, is there do the ones that glow stand out significantly from those that don't glow?
I mean, certainly as a not ingredient, because I've just said that's difficult to tell, but I mean, whether or not it's there is pretty apparent. But this is very similar to the shimmer or the value that like shimmer would add.
Now, I immediately thought halo, but I immediately thought of a halo,
Like
which
it's
would
good.
be good,
Right.
right? Would it be important if I look at that? Did that same thing come to mind, that I would use this to represent good, not use this to point out and get you to notice something that was bad?
Well, video games do that with like coins and things that you're trying to grab. They'll create a glow on an object, even if the object itself is transparent. So there are we see that in two-dimensional space because it's being used elsewhere. So
now, could I take that same gaming analogy? Because of course we always talk about we need to gamify our app, right? Could I take that and use this glow to signify this is the customer we need to go after? Would that make logical sense once somebody got that? As long as I continue to use that same metaphor, would that make sense?
I'd say that this the glow property should be rather like the ones that you select. You want to keep all the other properties like color, shape, and everything else we talked about, and the arrows.
Mhm.
The ones you select could maybe be the glow ones because they stand out, of course. But it could
Right.
mean anything. For me, they mean the selected ones. But I'm currently
Okay.
Yeah, it's you
just
could
binary
almost
value.
right, and you can almost I think you could almost get away with this effect more if all of the dots were the same size, if all the spheres were the same size, and then glow represented importance or scale. The brighter they are, the ones that you want to draw attention to, the more faint ones. But to combine the glow with the size of the sphere, and I'm looking specifically in the middle down at the bottom where you have both the small sphere and a large sphere with a dull glow, but then you have various sizes with bright glows. To me, that starts to confuse the meaning, where I start to focus more on either the glow or the sphere size, but trying to piece it together, what the logic between size and sphere, or size of the sphere and the glow percentage or value. That's where I start to get lost, if that makes sense.
Good. So Robert, I loved your input because I hadn't even tied that together when you said the selected ones. Remember when I started, this is a side-by-side with the traditional QlikSense app. And of course, it can use set analysis to know what the selected versus the non-selected are. And I think that's a great point. If I've selected it in Qlik, right, I'm showing it with the glow, even though I'm still showing you the ones that you would ordinarily leave behind. That's a great point. You clearly are a Qlik type of guy. So I love that. This one is called Metallicity. And quite frankly, I wasn't sure. I have zero notes in my notes here, like you can see them anyway. Zero notes on what normally this type of thing could represent. Does this property stand out or anything come to mind?
I'll be honest, you're literally visually interpreting the shiny object theory. And it's
okay.
But when, the question just becomes, and I say this generically, is somebody trying to get too creative? Because the shiny object is meant to draw attention, right? It's not, don't look over here, look over there. The challenge is that if you, like we've said about other style sets, if you use it in a form of transparency might make sense. If you use it in a sense of supportive storytelling, but anytime you add that metallic effect, it's almost, we're trained by Microsoft in Word and PowerPoint that this type of visual effect is just to jazz something up. It doesn't necessarily mean something. We haven't been trained to understand that this means something.
What you mentioned originally was it was the shiny object theory, which is new.
Yeah.
What if these were product lines and we wanted to point out that it's a new product line? Is that kind of property, does that fit with, because what I'm trying to think of, are there things that people naturally think in other areas of the world that we've never been able to visualize? Would that just mentally, I think that might make that transition. And that's what I was hoping for you guys. Throw things out and be like, yeah, that makes sense. It could be, if I wanted to use the property in the right way, it would be a newness of a property, of a product line, or a newness of a department, or an organization flow, or something. So for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. One other is opacity. And I think we mentioned that right at the get-go, right?
Yeah.
I want to be able to see it solid. I want to see through it. Hollow might mean, a bad performance. Solid means we're actually hitting our target. So this could be where I'm looking, comparing budget, what I've done compared to budget. Now here's one again with movement where I can look at the multitude of something, right? So imagine that the size of the sphere, the volume, is the amount of money a customer's done with me. And the dots, the satellites, are representing the opportunities in Salesforce. Does multitude and magnitude, when combined like this, does that tell you a story? You may look at one or the other first. When you can see them combined, does that help tell a story that I might miss if I didn't combine multitude and magnitude together?
So this reminds me of what you're talking about with like a social network. Like if the sphere subsumed those satellites, or those satellites were the number of people who were, in their orbit, quite literally. That seems really applicable.
Cool. And that's what I was hoping, that as just a couple come together, we start realizing, oh shoot, now it does become clear if I distinguish a multitude type measure from a magnitude type measure. But if I can see them together, I'm getting a different story than I might ordinarily. I'm going to go through these quick. Here's where I can control the size of the satellites. I happen to think, geez, that's the amount of the sales opportunities, right? Oh, great. Robert's got 55 opportunities for me, $3 each. Yay, he's buying Snickers bars from me, right? Versus, hey, I've got this other customer that has some very large opportunities. That might be where I need to focus time. Does that make sense as a use for that type of a size property for the satellite?
Yeah, anytime, I think size, shape, and color, because we are so ingrained with those visualization choices, size to represent more, big size more, small size less. Mm-hmm. Even if you do big and small floating around a big or small sphere, that is easily translatable into a story.
Good. And if used in the right use case, now I've got a whole bunch of factors here, don't I? That I would need a whole lot of bar charts to try to consume that same type of information. As we've progressed through this conversation, I think you guys are starting to be able to consume more things together and realizing, hey, that really has value. Satellite opacity, same type of thing as normal. I happen to think just from a forecasting standpoint, fantastic. Zach has 25 great deals. He went to a webinar and we're at the first stage of my forecast, right? I've had dinner with David 18 times and he's assured me that Thomas is about to sign the PO for $50 million, right? And then that satellite opacity matters to me as well. So now I'm consuming something more. I could also look at a radius around it, which I think when I've got so many dots here gets a little bit complex because I can't really tell which one was which.
Well, I think that's
that
only
could be my
because
proximity. How far away is David's opportunity, or how far
Right.
away is Robert's opportunity?
I think that would make more sense if your spheres were further apart, just to give yourself that inclusiveness.
And that is absolutely where being able to zoom in on this,
Right.
as opposed to seeing it statically, really would come into play. I'm gonna have to bounce through some of these. There was a color. Now, as you're looking at these, the way I use this movement when I visualized my friend's Peloton data was that this represented his heart rate. Right? When I see movement, what other things do you think that type of movement might indicate? Is that a hard one to perceive, or do we as humans
I go back.
instantly recognize a movement?
I go back to seismographs, volatility. The faster they're moving, the more violent it is. Is my initial, gut reaction when I see that.
Cool.
Aside
Perfect.
from some anxiety.
Gotcha.
No, they could also be. It could also visualize the ones that you need to look at, because they know if you have a mix of stable objects and
so I like it. This company is stable. We don't have anything to worry about. Their customer survey scores are great.
Yeah.
We're not at risk of losing them. These guys were worried maybe they're moving to our competitor. Right?
Also, like the age of a company process. So like you might have an super old process that doesn't move on that.
Okay. Versus an
Things
agile.
are slowing down. Yeah, because with age things slows down, right? In theory.
Yeah.
So the more vibrant and the more movement, the younger as a maturity scale.
Right.
Yeah, that's the way to phrase it.
Right. So I'm going to bounce through some of these really quick just for the sake of time. I could look at comparing these two, and as we look at, atmospheric conditions versus the movement, there's some similarities in what we might do, but we could combine those things to give us both, right? Now it starts getting a little bit complicated for your eyes because this is brand new, right? But I think in the long run, there's some real value that could be, hey, I need to focus on this, and then I can look at that. These things can also have a vertical, they can have a speed, and they can have a vertical, up or down or side to side. And then I think that adds some very uniqueness to it. What I'm going to go ahead and do is jump to this video, though. So what I've done is I've recorded a very small clip, and I'm going to get you to set up. This is SAP data. So what I'm looking at right now, is my screen still showing for you guys?
Yeah.
Okay. What I'm looking at now is SAP data, where I'm looking at country, office, and salesperson, and I'm just looking, all the dots are even size, right? And what I'm going to do is begin gradually in my demo adding one more visual element, right? Because I don't want to overwhelm you from the jump, but I'm going to add one more element at a time, where I'm now going to size the sphere by their days sales outstanding. This means how long does it take for them to pay us? Let me pause for a second here. All right. So how long does it take them to pay us? This is a common measure that is weighted, right? The fact that it's weighted tells me it's volume, and that's why I sized it by my weighted measure, but I colored it by a different measure, which is how many days does it take, right? So the weighting is based on the size of the deal and the time to take versus the color. Now, as I look at that and I can see, well, of course, I've got to have my scale for color, but I can see that this one salesman for this office in the United States, dramatically different than everybody else, right? That jumps out at me really quick, I hope, right? Once I've got the properties. Now, I'm going to go ahead and move this around and actually move so that you could see there is interaction with this thing, because what we end up seeing is I've got a whole bunch of these purples. So within the United States, there's a lot of similarity, except on this row here, which happens to be Philadelphia. So this is a case where I've got very few colors. Do the colors help you understand and find the outliers really quickly?
I mean, the short answer is yes, but on the color spectrum, I would have used from dark to light. And you know, you're using multiple hues.
Absolutely, great point. And I apologize. I took their out of the box color scheme, but I narrowed it down.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Absolutely configurable.
But with that said, about a quarter of the way through the chart from that kind of magenta hue into your purples and blues, we have to keep in mind that with things like color sensitivity, color blindness, a lot of those hues, the range of those hues, there's some very subtle changes.
Right.
So in that row that you pointed out, there may be some variation within the purples and the magenta purple and the blue purple, but they're so close together value-wise,
right,
that you can't distinguish them right off the bat. To some folks, it'll just look like all one color.
Right. And so this is definitely be where I would fix the color scale, and I would definitely have classifications. But what I want to show was, man, that Philadelphia jumps out, right?
Sure.
I'm finding the weak link in sales compared to all their peers. I'm also finding the city that may have completely different payment terms. As I go through this, you'll notice I've got satellites, which represent opportunities, and the size of the opportunities. So unfortunately, I can't zoom in here much more, but you'll see little dots. So this guy who has really bad performance and his customers don't pay also has $5 deals that we're never going to get paid on, versus this salesperson who gets us paid and has great deals. And therefore, David, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to let you go, and your deals are going to get turned over to Robert because we're tired of $3 deals that we never get paid on. So that kind of finishes. Let me stop sharing. Guys, I want to thank you again. I know this was a weird kind of process because what we're trying to do has never, ever been done before, right? We're trying to look at these things. Hopefully that final demo gave you a semblance. I've got 25 visual properties. Do I want to use all of them? Probably not. But if I find the right use cases like shiny objectivity, or I've got volatility, or I want to look at stable, or I want to look at agile, or I want to look at diversity, or I want to look at instability, or I want to look at standard deviation, there's some visual properties we could start combining that tells a really, really strong story compared to what I could do in a classic bar chart. Now, this isn't something you're going to give to your CEO, David. I promise you that. And you're laughing like, duh, I know you're not going to give that to my CEO. But this is the kind of thing I think that data analysts who need a bigger story than what they can get in classic 2D charts, this is the kind of thing that I think really helps us. And in the right cases, I think the fact that the visual property automatically means something to us would make it easier as I start turning these things on, because it's already going to make sense, right? Versus I'm looking at a plot, and the size represents the number of customers, and that doesn't make sense to me.
Well, and I think to your point, just real quick, in a more operational environment, I could see a heavy use case for these types of visualizations. Not so much for an actionable opportunity leader view, but really digging into what's happening, why is it happening, how is it happening, where is it happening. For the folks consuming data on that level and doing the analytics on that level, I could see heavy use case for it.
And what about if, since it is recordable, could you see delivering a story in a meeting room?
Right.
And you'd be excited about that. Thomas needs to be the first guy we show this to.
Well, in showing that story or telling that story visually, not just interpreting the story visually.
Exactly.
But telling the story visually in an animated sort of way could be really appealing.
Exactly. I think of the Hans Rowling thing, right?
Yeah.
Guys, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your day. I know each and every one of you are busy. I appreciate you. And of course, people out there in the world are going to decide whether Dorkcast 7 was worth the hour and a half we spent together, or if this is bizarre and there's no such validity to any of these things. I am absolutely going to stake claim to every word you gave me and take it as my own, and there'd be no credit due to any of you. Any parting words, Zach?
I appreciate the opportunity to review this stuff. I mean, to me, this is the beginning of like augmented reality, data analytics. Just feels like very pioneering with what's possible, and used well. I can't imagine this not being the next compelling way to tell a data story.
Robert, how about you, buddy?
I think also that this needs to go into virtual reality or augmented reality. You need to be able to walk into the 3D models. Otherwise, it's going to always be like on the edge of not being useful.
Okay.
Once we get to that, I mean, it's already happening with meetings with virtual reality where you can see each other and walk around. This is going to come into an analytics, and then this will make much more sense.
Yep. David?
Fully agree with both of those comments. I think at the end of the day, we just have to be careful to not overuse for the sake of overusing.
Right.
We've got to be strategic and mindful about the decisions we're making to tell these stories and make sure that it's applicable. If it isn't, don't worry about it. Find another use case, another time to use it. But again, just be mindful of how it's used. But otherwise, I'll absolutely love the direction. I'd be excited to use it, that's for sure. So let me know when it's ready for prime time.
Well, the great news is that session can be collaborative. So you can invite people to share the same session as you walk and navigate. And best of all, it is available with goggles. It's just really, really hard for anybody to look at this. If I had this on and had a set of goggles, I'd be totally unbelievable then. Plus, it's hard for me to get my video down inside of it. But yeah, all those things are out there. So guys, have a great day. Thank you for helping me make what I hope was Dorkcast number 7 very memorable for everyone. Have a great day, everybody.